I love this panel. Coming from open source roots, I know how hard that collaboration can be, especially when you have the conflicting interests of commercial partners and end users and maintainers. It can be rough, but observability is better with friends. And so I think we have a very delightful panel set up for you today. Let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. So Amy Tobey is a principal engineer at Equinix Metal. Amy is currently bootstrapping an SRE team that owns observability, incident management, and SLO programs. And while this panel is full of OTel contributors, Amy is here representing end users. Andrew Hayworth is a staff engineer at GitHub, where he spends his time building observability systems and contributing to the OTel project. Andrew enjoys many things, but he's not entirely sure if computers are one of those things or not. Maybe we'll find out in this session. Liz Fong-Jones is a principal developer advocate here at Honeycomb. This is her second panel of the day, and I think that's kind of fitting because in addition to her advocacy work or co-authoring the observability engineering book, Liz is also a member of the governance committee for the OTel project. You'll see her a number of places, so she is here as well. And our moderator today is Ted Young. Ted is the Director of Developer Education at Lightstep. He's also a co-founder of the OpenTelemetry project. Thanks for moderating, Ted. I'll hand it over to you now.
Hey, thanks for the intro, George. Let's jump right into it. So collaboration in OSS, in particular in the OpenTelemetry project, to me has been a really enjoyable experience. But I would love to hear from our panelists who have all been involved in the project. So to sort of kick it off, I'd just love to know what experience in particular comes to mind with the collaborating within the OpenTelemetry community that really stands out to you. And Amy, do you want to maybe start our round here?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned when you introduced me, I'm working on this observability project at work. And one of the stacks that we run is a Ruby stack. And so I started using OpenTelemetry Ruby pretty early on, earlier this year, and immediately ran into problems trying to do some very complex things like propagating trace parents over weird things, right? Like I put it in a JSON field in a Postgres database, but I couldn't get that going. And so I went on the CNCF Slack. So somebody suggested that to me, and ended up working with Andrew on it a little bit. I posted a little bit of example code, and Andrew looked at it and kind of helped figure out what was going on and talked me through it. And that was just a really great experience. Being able to connect with an old friend, and then also get some help from the community and move forward and figure some stuff out.
Awesome. Andrew, do you want to follow that up?
Yeah, no, it's a natural segue, isn't it? It's actually one of my favorite experiences too. For starters, it was really nice to be able to feel helpful and actually say, oh, I know something, I can help you out with this, I've been here. And I've actually had that experience a few times with the OpenTelemetry Ruby community so far, and that's been really nice. It's hard to find a really specific experience that stands out to me, but I will say that the OTel community has felt very welcoming to me overall, and as a whole, it stands apart from other open source projects that I've contributed to in the past. And I don't really know what the secret sauce is. I don't know exactly how it's ended up this way, but I've never felt like I couldn't be a part of this community. I felt like it was open and available, and as long as I wanted to show up and help out, I was welcome. And that to me is actually the defining thing. It's the first open source project that I've really wanted to contribute to in a while and felt like I could.
Oh, awesome. That really makes me happy as someone who put a lot of effort into the project early on to try to make sure it was structured in a way that was going to be welcoming, collaborative. I'm always happy to hear people enjoy that, and they're now sticking around as maintainers and then paying it forwards to like other new members who are coming in, like we're here to hear. But I'm the moderator here. Liz, what about you? Do you have any specific memories here?
Yeah, so I think two things. One, I wanted to riff off of what Andrew said and say that the CNCF ethos of chop wood, carry water, like really, really resonates with how we run things in OpenTelemetry, where we're all here kind of not to be kind of front and center. We are here to chop wood, carry water for our users, right? We are here to make our users' job easier. And everything else follows from that, right? Like, it doesn't matter, right, that Ted and I work for companies that compete with each other, right? Like, we're here to help users. But I think that that wasn't always the case. And I think that kind of historical context of the open census and open tracing projects is kind of what led us to, from the lessons learned that we needed to collaborate better, right? I remember, 4 years ago, Yana Dogan and I were at Google, and we were like, "Rob, those people at Open Tracing have it so wrong, and this is why their framework is so bad," right? I'm like, wait a second, why is this, right? Like, why are we not contributing and pitching in to make it better, right? And that's where OTel came from, was from, let's take the best parts of Open Census and Open Tracing and put them together for our users.
Yeah. I actually have a specific memory of that. Early on, when it became clear it was just too big of a leap, even though it made sense to a lot of people to merge the projects, just being able to just go Shazam, done was just difficult. And we needed to find some kind of common ground. And that ended up being working through the W3C on getting tracing headers established. This is something that was valuable to everyone working on tracing, regardless what project they were working for. And it ended up being a place where me, some other leadership people from the open tracing side, and some people who were running the open census project were all collaborating. And there's this aspect of collaborating where once you kind of get to know each other as people and like actually get to work with each other, it kind of lowers that barrier. It's just that human aspect to it. And I really feel like that collaboration experience was a key part of like an enzyme that led to the projects merging. So I have like really fond memories of those days. But one thing we've been talking about here that I think sometimes tries to get swept under the rug, but we're talking about openly, which I think has been an important part of OpenTelemetry's success in being welcoming, is actually recognizing that there are a bunch of companies involved. There's various vendors who are trying to use this. There's the big dog infrastructure platforms like Google and Microsoft and Amazon. There's end users who are running huge systems who really, really need this to work. And that can put a lot of pressure on an open source community. And I'm wondering what people think in that realm. Like, what's important to take into account when you're building a community that's obviously going to include those kinds of forces and pressures?
It's really interesting.
Gonna go for it.
The thing I see in the OTel community and a lot of the CNCF stuff is it's the same thing we do as SREs, right? Is focus on the users. Mm-hmm. Like, what if you can focus on your own company, but if you're hurting your users by competing for over undifferentiated lifting, that's bad for your users. The way I look at it, one of the big arguments I use to commit Equinix Metal to OpenTelemetry was, we can make this decision now, and we can defer the vendor decision until we have something to actually look at in there, and we're not trying to guess in the dark, and that was good for me as a user, and I think it was good for y'all as vendors too. Mm-hmm. That we have this opportunity to now use the best tool for the job and not the one that we're stuck with because it's littered through our code.
There's so many people who had been burned by, we got stuck with one vendor's library, right? Like, it was a hindrance to the entire ecosystem. We needed to fix it for everyone. But I think the other interesting thing here is Matthew S. Wilson is this amazing person who's been in open source communities forever. And I love his writing about like the Apache way of doing things, right? Where the Apache Foundation has this attitude of, yes, your employer pays for you to be here, but like, you are representing yourself. You are representing yourself on behalf of users, not your company, right? And we've in fact had people move between companies within the OTel ecosystem, and I think that's fantastic, right? That the governance committee slot or the technical committee slot belongs to the individual on the basis of what they've done for the community, not to the company.
Yeah, I'd love to drill into that more. There is just this aspect where if you're getting paid to work on open source, it's usually awesome because presumably you're geeking out about this stuff, and that's why you want to do it. But you do end up with what can feel like a foot in two different camps. You're working for a company, they have interests, you're a personal member of this community, and you want to promote that community. Do people have advice for how they navigate that? Their boundaries you try to set? How do you make that work for you?
I don't know that I've actually figured it out, frankly. It's kind of rough. I try to go into it knowing that, while I work at GitHub now, I may not always work at GitHub. And I want my contributions to reflect who I am and the good work that I've done going forward. I don't want it to be sort of only attached to GitHub's legacy. I want it to be part of what I do and who I am. So I try to keep that in mind. But I don't think I actually have a really good answer here. I'm curious what y'all think.
But authenticity is really important, right? That seems to be a key element.
That the boundaries are hard, right? Like, there's the mythos is that we work all day and then we work on open source at night. But the reality is this, a lot of us don't have those nights free to work on open source. So, I'm a parent. My evenings are largely spoken for anymore. So I do it at work, and at work I have to balance open source contributions against the needs of the company. And like when I find something that's, lined up where everything lines up and it's, I can do an open source thing and it meets the business goals. That's kind of that magic spot where you get to have a lot of fun, because, I went and put together OTel CLI is because it was like, hey, this is not really differentiating for our company. It helps us kind of get more tracing down into like shell code and things like that. And it can be good for the community. So it was kind of that when those things come together, it's always a little bit magical and fun to be able to just go charge forward and put something out in the world.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, if I'm working on open source in my spare time, I'm like, I do not want to build community about this. I'm like, this is my trash side project. Don't you dare run this in production.
I definitely have fun sometimes with side projects to use OTel and to submit feedback during work hours later about like, hey, I tried this, it broke, right? But definitely my core contributions to OTel are happening when I'm, doing my day job. I think the way that I kind of navigate this is, what am I doing for the user? And to recognize there are other valid ways of doing this too, right? I need to listen to them, but I think that, the commercial perspective of Honeycomb has a perspective that we can bring to the project of what we think is good for users, right? Like that's a perspective that, should be represented, and yes, we do disclose that, yes, this is our interest, and we're happy to listen to other interests too.
Yeah.
And there's a diversity and resilience argument in there, right? Which we talk about this all the time in organizational dynamics. But the diversity of all of the different vendors contributing to this community, you get the kind of the crosshatch of all those ideas and desires and things, and you get a more resilient product on the other side because of all the way that, the people have to kind of not just say, we're going to do this because I say it should be this way, but you have people to challenge you and to make the best decisions for the community as opposed to for Honeycomb or Lightstep or whoever.
Yeah, that's actually always stood out to me, is that all of the different committees seems to have a really good makeup of people representing different vendors and different groups and different companies. And that's fantastic. I think it does result in a better product. Absolutely. It keeps it from running away and becoming some company's sort of free labor that they get to help them build their product, which doesn't really benefit anyone else. I love that about this project. I love that everyone's working together on it like this.
We put some work into the design of the project to kind of ensure that. So there's rules around the governance structure where it can't end up getting overrepresented by a company. We have an RFC OTEP process rather than like a BDFL process. And the original scope of the project included telemetry, but not analysis and backend, because we kind of recognize telemetry as the area where we can all come to agreement in a straightforward fashion, like what language should systems use to describe themselves. And if we got into the work of like, here's an analysis to OpenTelemetry trace analysis, then that would turn into a weird place.
It's useful boundary.
And there are excellent projects out there, right? Like we collaborate with Jaeger, we collaborate with Prometheus, right? Like those are kind of the clean boundaries. There are open source implementations. And also we do privilege open source implementations with our exporters, right? That the open source implementations are directly integrated because they're open source code and open source backends.
Yeah. And I like that y'all sliced off the part that needs to be nested into my code. Right. That's the part where me as a consumer go, vendors come and go, tools come and go, But like the things that I put in my code that, 3 years from now, people have moved around teams and stuff. Nobody knows how it got there or why it's there. I don't have to try to go and rip all that crap out and replace it with some other library anymore. We can make that commitment and move forward for hopefully a decade before we even have to think about upgrading any of that stuff. And that to me is like really valuable as an engineer.
Yeah. And having some predictableness to what that code produces that's gone through a process of getting a lot of feedback from different groups around what kind of observations are important.
It took us a while to get there, though, right? Like it took us 2 years to go from nascency to release candidate. And I think a lot of that was trying to get this right so that, Amy could bake this into her code and have it be valid for 10 years.
I feel like we now really, truly understand why standards take time.
Now that you help to build one.
Yeah, it's just a different process from like, I am like an auteur with my, finely crafted opinions, and I'm just gonna put my opinions out there and you can like them or not. Like there's certainly a place for that. But when you try to get to something like a standard where you're hoping everyone is going to run it and it's something that's going to interconnect things, like the internet is built out of protocols and standards kind of for this reason, because it's about interconnection, and OpenTelemetry, I think, is part of that. But actually, this is a good pivot point. I'm curious. Obviously, people do want to go out there and experiment, right, and build interesting things. And I'm curious, having been a part of the OpenTelemetry community, there's the part where we want to move slowly and get agreement. Where are the places where people today in this ecosystem, if you really want to start doing something innovative or like pushing the boundaries, where would you suggest people look?
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Hotel CLI, Amy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't going to toot my own horn, but
I'll do it for you.
Like that was one of the ones where I sat there when I started writing it. I thought, I could probably go read all the OTEPs and try to get all the terminology lined up. But what we really need is to get this idea out there. It's kind of based on the Honeyvent idea, which I think is based on some other ideas that came before. So I'm not taking full credit for it, but just sitting there and going, we just need to throw a solution against the wall, get it out in front of some people, and see what happens. See if it's something that people want.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the CLI and what it does and how it works?
Yeah. It at the simplest layer, you take Cobra, which is a kind of full-featured command line library for Go that lets you write command line tools pretty straightforward, and the OpenTelemetry Go library, and mash them together. So that what you can do is, what the use case I had was, in every infrastructure, modern infrastructure, most of the world is held together by shell scripts, right? Like we want to pretend that we pushed it all down underneath Kubernetes and all this stuff, and we kind of stamp around a little to make it nice and smooth, but it's all shell scripts at the bottom. And I want traces to go as far down and close to the metal as possible. And so one of the challenges I had is sometimes code, in our infrastructure, and just about everywhere I've ever worked, this happens. There's some loop where some piece of code calls a shell script and then it curls out to some other service. And why do I want that to be a gap in my telemetry? I want it to carry through that shell script. And so that's why I wrote Hotel CLI.
That's awesome.
I think if we can pick apart the broader pattern, right? The broader pattern is unsolved problem, no clear way of doing it. Okay, let's throw something against the wall and see if it sticks, right? Like I think that for the surface area of gRPC services, right? Like that's an area where we've had to work very carefully because there are a lot of gRPC services out there. We want to make sure that we get it right. Whereas that isn't a constraint for problems like Hotel CLI, or problems like there's this emerging focus group within OpenTelemetry around how do we integrate logging into all of this, to which there is no known answer yet. We are figuring that out.
I think another interesting area that's come up recently, I think Weaveworks released a tool called Kspan recently that actually highlights what Kubernetes is doing as it goes about its business, and actually makes that visible for the first time. I think there's a ton of areas that could be explored like that, places where we've never even bothered to look for telemetry before. The Hotel CLI is a great way. I mean, you could, now that we have that, you could actually use that as the basis for a lot of your experiments and go pretty far with it. But I think there's a whole world, like Amy said, of things close to the metal that we didn't really observe before because it was difficult, or it was embedded, or HAProxy just released an open tracing integration natively recently, and there is an area that could be done. Normally, you don't ever do anything inside that system because you want it to be fast and performant. And there's a lot of places close to the metal that I think we can work on. A ton of stuff there.
Yeah.
Close to the metal or kind of closed box. I think there were questions earlier about Kafka tracing, right? How do you trace requests going through a Kafka broker? Really exciting work to do there, where we know how to get from producers to consumers, but how do you trace the actual inner broker protocol?
They announced something yesterday, didn't they? Confluent did. With
exciting.
OpenTelemetry.
Oh,
I forget what it was.
Yay.
This is
I
my
didn't see
long-term
that.
hope that observability becomes kind of like a best practice like testing, where if you're building a database or you're building these tools, you're thinking about observability and you're thinking about how do I give people not just this data, but then a playbook kind of explaining what to do with the information that I gave you.
Yes.
Right, it's this thing where we don't want OpenTelemetry to have contrib repos for everything, right? Like OpenTelemetry should be baked into every library.
That's the hope once it's stable.
That and I want all my SaaS and open source components or even closed components to emit OTLP, right? It's a thing that's starting to emerge. It's something I want to do as a project, as a product feature down the road for what I work on. That's way future stuff. But like, if I can start to have these things, if I'm using a SaaS on one part, but my service interacts with it, and they just emit OTLP to my tracing vendor, all of a sudden now I can start to stitch all these pieces together. And that makes a huge difference, not just in incidents and troubleshooting, but like just in the part that I get really excited about is when I show this to engineers who haven't seen it before. All of a sudden now they have their mental model start snapping together in ways that they just didn't before, because holy crap, we use that? That's in that path? Those are the things that I think are super exciting and are still kind of just starting to happen.
As Shirley likes to say, the mean time to WTF.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, but this actually, so we've got maybe 6 minutes left, and I think the question I'd like to end on, and then after this we'll go into Slack. There's been some questions there, and we'll follow up there asynchronously. But one thing that I think comes up in these kinds of projects is there's a need to be extensible and also like cover every use case because it's a standard. And in the process of doing that, you can make things really complicated. But for new users and people getting started, and for frankly, the success of an open source project, you need it to be like simple and kind of smooth and slick. And I think that is a tricky balancing act. I personally think we have a lot more work to do in OpenTelemetry to make it smoother and easier to get started with. But I'm wondering, do people have thoughts on that subject, both for OpenTelemetry and open source in general?
Yeah, make your launchers generic.
Yeah.
I
They're
love
generic.
a Lightstep OTel launcher for Go,
Yeah.
right? But like, I can't just use it because the engineers get a little quibbly when they see, well, I have to set ls underscore whatever too, right? But like, and Honeycomb, I think, just released a Java one recently. And so I see the vendors starting to do this for the launchers. But I'm also kind of at a loss sometimes for like, where's the secret sauce here? What's specific to Honeycomb or to Lightstep or whoever? But like, that's one of those things I see happening that's kind of cool that's happening organically like that. But those I think are those filing off those rough edges that I think everybody struggles with when they first start getting with OpenTelemetry. I had a hard time when I started like, what the hell is all this boilerplate?
Right, like, what is a trace text map propagator doing in here, right? Like,
and why do I have to care about it?
Yeah.
And most of my engineers, a lot of engineers, they just don't want to. I just have to do this thing. I have this story I need to write code for, and I'm told I need to put observability in it. Like, the understanding can come later, but we need to get people to actually put in the traces first.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really big deal. We were talking about this in the Ruby working group yesterday. Why do we have to have all this boilerplate to set it up? And it turns out, I think part of the reason is because we default to the wrong port accidentally. But so we might be able to make it easier. But there was a goal that was expressed there that you should be able to require this library in your little Ruby script and mostly get a working setup right out of the box. You shouldn't need an OTel launcher package. You shouldn't need a vendor's distro. And I really appreciated that perspective on it, that you shouldn't really need to have to look at a code sample for the happy path. I think that's an area that the OpenTelemetry project needs a lot of help in, actually.
Yeah.
Defining what precisely is the happy path, and then saying, if you choose to do it this way, all you have to do is include the library and it's going to start working. That's extremely, extremely exciting for people. I did a demo internally of one of our apps. It had a little bit of boilerplate, but one of the things that blew people away was I said, look at all of this tracing that's happening, and it's all auto-instrumented. I haven't written a single span myself, and it's useful and it's great. That type of ease and out of the box usefulness is really important. You can obviously go overboard with it and make bad decisions, but I think that's one of the areas I personally want to focus on coming up soon, is making it that simple, making it easy for people to get started.
Yeah.
I think we're at this interesting point in the evolution where we had to toss a lot of scope off of the boat as we were working towards 1.0. You can always add new convenience methods, but you can't take away kind of core functionality people are relying upon. So that motivated a lot of the, okay, let's ship the bare minimum thing with you having to tweak all the config knobs. Vendors can experiment with doing distros and launchers, and then we'll bring the best of those into the core project, right? Like, I think that's kind of where we are now. The other interesting thing that I was seeing was I was actually comparing the .NET boilerplate to other languages boilerplate, and just seeing the language runtime support just makes it so much easier, right? Because then you can just use terminology that feels native to the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for any language developers listening in, consider baking this stuff into your runtime, especially context propagation. It's freaking weird that we do that in userland. End brand. Yeah.
There's a weird side effect in some of that, though, where if it wasn't the way that Liz described, where it was kind of these rough edges were exposed, I think we might see a little bit less pickup of the collector, because the happy path today is set it all up, don't worry about authentication or anything, and just forward to a local collector and let it bounce it out to it, and then do the authentication to your vendor there. And that pattern actually, I think, is super good for all of us, for reasons I think others will go into. But like, sometimes we regret these decisions. We look back and go like, yeah, that sharp edge probably makes adoption a little harder. But in the long run, establishing the pattern of using the collector everywhere is really healthy, I think, just about everybody.
Yeah, I feel like the happy path is becoming very clear, especially for people who are doing things like service mesh and all of that kind of stuff, where if we can make OpenTelemetry just have like the defaults be a one-liner that send OTLP, to a local collector, or your service mesh or something that's going to proxy it over to your collector, and you do all your configuration in a collector, that is so smooth. So yeah, I'm hoping to see us promote all of this stuff now that the 1.0s are starting to land.
Yeah, that's exciting that those are.
Yeah, cool. Well, we're coming up on the end of our panel here. I think George is going to pop on and say thanks to all of us. But I want to, first of all, just say thanks to you three for being such wonderful contributors and collaborators. It's definitely people like you who make the project awesome, for the new people coming in. And for the people who are listening to this talk, come say hi in the OpenTelemetry Slack over in CNCF. We're always looking for new contributors. So thank you very much.